She was 20 years old, standing outside a nightclub, calling her friends 9 times in a row. Nobody answered. 20 minutes later, a stranger walked up, put his arm around her shoulders, and told the people standing nearby that he'd get her home safe. 2 days after that, police forced open the front door of a quiet house on an ordinary residential street and found something no officer in that department had ever seen before. Every object inside, every chair, every plate, every mattress, wrapped piece by piece in thick, clear plastic. What happened in the hours between that nightclub wall and that plastic-wrapped house is one of the most disturbing chains of events I've ever covered on this channel. Not because of one single terrible decision, but because of how many small, ordinary failures lined up one after another until a young woman with her whole future planned out ran directly into a man who had already decided, months in advance, exactly what he wanted. If you're new here, this is Buried Truth Crime, and we go deep into real cases most people have never heard the full story behind. Hit subscribe before we start because we post new cases every single day, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's get into it. Her name was India Chipchase. She grew up in Northampton, England, in a stable, close family, and by the time she reached university, she already knew exactly what she wanted her life to look like. She was studying health and social care management, working toward one specific career, becoming a paramedic. And she didn't wait around for a diploma to start proving she could do the job. India took on an internship at a local hospital, and according to the staff who worked alongside her, she didn't ask for the easy shifts. She asked for the hard ones. She kept volunteering to extend her own placement, completely unpaid, because the experience mattered more to her than the paycheck. Somehow, she still had time for everything else in her life. She stayed in excellent physical shape. She coached a youth netball team on weekends, and when she wasn't studying or interning or coaching, she was pulling long shifts behind the bar at a local pub, saving every pound toward one very specific goal: moving out of her mother's house and building an independent life on her own terms. Everyone who knew India described her the same way: warm, easy to talk to, endlessly busy, the kind of person who made friends without even trying. Now hold that image in your head, and let's talk about the man whose house she would end up inside less than 48 hours later. His name was Edward Tenniswood, 52 years old, a former accountant, and in almost every way that mattered socially, the complete opposite of India. Tenniswood lived an extremely isolated life. We talk about quiet loners a lot on this channel, but his situation went further than that description usually covers. Neighbors avoided him. And more tellingly, his own family had cut him off entirely, more than 20 years earlier, after he was caught repeatedly stealing money from relatives. When investigators started digging into his past, tracing old contacts back to his younger years in London, they came back with a detail that stopped them cold. Not one single person they interviewed could remember Tenniswood ever being seen with a woman. No relationships, no girlfriends, nothing across decades. But there was one incident from his earlier life that stood out. A woman who had known him years before told police that after she turned down a kiss, he pulled a knife on her. An instant, disproportionate burst of aggression triggered by nothing more than being told no. And here's the detail that changes everything about how you should think of this case. At the exact moment these two lives were about to intersect, Tenniswood was not supposed to be walking around free. Roughly 2 weeks earlier, he had been formally arrested on suspicion of a serious sexual assault against a different young woman. The case was active. Evidence was being gathered. It was moving step by step toward court. And under standard legal procedure, he was granted bail. A 52-year-old man with a documented history of violent overreaction, facing an open and serious allegation, released back into his own home with nothing to do but wait for a court date. Keep that single fact in your mind because it explains almost everything that follows. Let's walk through the night itself because the timeline matters here more than almost any case we've covered. It was Friday, the 29th of January, 2016, an entirely ordinary weekend for India. She met up with 3 close friends. For the sake of this story, we'll call them Alice, Harry, and Grant. And the group spent the early evening together before heading into central Northampton's main nightlife strip, an area known as Market Square. They ended up at one of the biggest venues in the district, a 3-story building with a restaurant, multiple dance floors, and a large outdoor terrace. On a Friday night, the place was packed shoulder to shoulder, loud, chaotic, the kind of environment where it's easy to lose sight of the people you came with. At around 1:45 in the morning, that's exactly what happened. India got separated from her friends. Not unusual in a venue that size, but Alice, Harry, and Grant noticed quickly and started searching for her almost immediately. What they couldn't see, because they weren't with her, was what the club's own internal security cameras were already recording. India, visibly overserved, lost her balance and fell. Staff responded exactly the way they were trained to. A security guard helped her to her feet and, following the venue's standard policy for intoxicated guests, escorted her outside. He didn't just leave her at the curb either. He flagged down a passing taxi, helped her into the back seat, and only returned to his post once he believed she was safely on her way home. That should have been the end of the story right there. It wasn't, because of one small, almost bureaucratic detail that most people outside the United Kingdom don't even know exists. In the UK, taxi drivers are legally allowed to ask passengers to pay the fare up front before a trip even begins. The fare that night would have come to roughly £10. India either didn't have enough cash on her or refused to pay in advance. Accounts differ slightly, but the outcome was the same either way. She got back out of the taxi. She walked a few steps back toward the club entrance, hoping to get back inside. But Dr. policy at venues like this one is strict. Once you've been removed for intoxication, you don't get let back in. Full stop. One of the door staff suggested she simply call herself another taxi. Instead, India stepped away from the entrance and leaned against the outer brick wall of the building. Directly above her, mounted on the exterior of the building, was a security camera. It would end up recording almost every minute of what happened next. She pulled out her phone and started calling Grant. Once, twice. By the end of it, phone records would show 9 calls placed in rapid succession, every single one going straight to voicemail, because the thick walls of the club were killing cell signal for everyone still inside, including the friends who were, at that very moment, actively searching for her. A bystander near the entrance, a young man we'll call Christopher, later told police he noticed India specifically because she looked visibly upset that no one was answering. He eventually got into his own taxi and left. And with that, India was now completely alone outside the club. Just a few minutes later, the same exterior camera picked up an older man approaching her directly. Dark jacket, backpack over one shoulder, unhurried, confident body language. The kind of approach that suggested he already knew exactly who he was walking toward and wasn't worried about anyone stopping him. Witnesses standing nearby would later tell investigators they clearly overheard him say something along the lines of promising to make sure she got home safely. He put an arm around her shoulders. The next street camera down the block captured the two of them walking together toward a waiting taxi and getting into the back seat together. Meanwhile, at 3 in the morning, Alice, Harry, and Grant finally gave up searching the club, floor by floor, and stepped outside. The moment their phones reconnected to a signal, Grant's screen lit up with those 9 missed calls. They called back immediately. No answer, just ringing. And here's the part that, if you're honest with yourself, you probably would have done too. They assumed the most reasonable explanation available to them, that she'd found another way home, and was already back in her own bed, asleep. Reassured by that completely logical conclusion, the group called their own taxi and went home for the night. If this story is unsettling you as much as it unsettled me putting it together, drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people, and I read every single one of them. Saturday morning arrived, and India's mother, Susan, walked into her daughter's bedroom to find the bed empty. On its own, that wasn't cause for panic. India could easily have stayed the night at a friend's place, but there was one detail that immediately felt wrong. India always sent a quick text after a night out, just to let her family know she was okay. This time, there was nothing. Susan sent a few messages, waited, then tried calling. The phone rang and rang with no answer. The real alarm came at 4 o'clock that afternoon when India failed to show up for her scheduled shift at the pub. Her mother knew instantly that something was seriously wrong. India simply did not miss work. Susan contacted the police immediately and reported her daughter missing. Investigators didn't let that report sit. They started interviewing the people closest to India within hours. Grant handed over his phone, giving detectives an exact minute-by-minute call log from the night before. Officers pulled the nightclub's exterior security footage and began reviewing it frame by frame, eventually identifying the exact moment India got into the taxi and pulling the vehicle's license plate straight off the recording. The driver was located and brought in for questioning that same day. What he told investigators was deeply concerning. India, he said, had appeared completely disoriented in the back seat throughout the ride. The older man traveling with her had controlled the entire trip, giving directions, naming the destination. That destination was a residential street called Stanley Road, roughly a 5-minute drive from the club. Once they arrived, the man paid the fare, helped India out of the car, and the two of them walked off together down the street. Now investigators needed one thing above everything else: a name. And this is where a single officer's memory became the turning point of the entire case. While reviewing the exterior footage from Market Square, one of the officers on the review team studied the face of the unidentified man on the monitor and recognized him instantly. It was the same man the very officer had personally interviewed only weeks earlier in connection with the open sexual assault case. At the same time, the department launched a public appeal, posting India's photograph and asking anyone who might have seen her that night to come forward. A local resident, who we'll refer to as Patrick, contacted police shortly after. He had been driving slowly down Stanley Road late that night with his window down and had pulled over to take a phone call. In that exact moment, an unusual pair walked directly past his open window, a very young woman and a man who appeared to be well into his 50s. Patrick clearly remembered watching the two of them turn toward one of the houses and walk through the front door. When police later showed him photographs, he identified the same man without any hesitation. Between the taxi driver's account, Patrick's statement, and the security footage tracing the entire route, investigators now had a name, a face, and an exact address. Officers headed straight for Stanley Road. What they found inside that house is the part of this story that stayed with investigators long after the case closed. After forcing open the front door and getting no response, officers stepped into a house that didn't look like the scene of anything violent at first glance. It looked staged. Nearly every object inside, every piece of furniture, every kitchen surface, every plate and cup, arranged in strict, almost geometric order, had been carefully wrapped in thick, clear plastic sheeting. Not a casual habit, a deliberate, methodical process that would have taken hours to complete. In the bedroom, one of the responding officers found a mattress lying on the floor, also sealed in the same plastic. Beneath it was India. She had been positioned with obvious deliberateness, her hair arranged carefully around her. This was not the result of panic, and it was not an accident. Whoever did this had taken their time. A locked study elsewhere in the house held something that reframed the entire investigation. Shelves packed with hundreds of magazine clippings, nearly all of them featuring women who shared one very specific look: tall, slim, and dark-haired. Investigators also discovered bags of women's clothing and shoes that did not belong to India, carefully sorted and sealed away in plastic. Where those items came from was never fully established. Detectives then pulled 2 full weeks of the club's exterior footage, going all the way back to the day Tenniswood was released on bail. What they found was a clear, repeating pattern. Night after night, he had returned to the same spot near the club entrance, positioned himself in a dark area, and simply watched people leave. He ignored large groups entirely. He waited specifically for someone who was alone. As for the homeowner himself, he hadn't run. On Saturday morning, he had calmly locked his own front door and walked to a nearby hotel, where he checked himself into an ordinary room. Less than a full day after officers discovered India inside that house, a plainclothes team located him sitting in the hotel's lounge area, eating a meal and calmly refreshing local news coverage of the search for the missing student. When officers approached and placed him in handcuffs, he didn't resist, didn't panic, and didn't protest his innocence. He reportedly told them he was surprised it hadn't taken them longer to find him. At trial in July of 2016, Tenniswood offered an account that fell apart almost immediately under scrutiny. He claimed the encounter had been consensual and that he simply hadn't realized what was happening until it was too late. The forensic evidence told an entirely different story. Toxicology results confirmed that India's level of intoxication that night left her in no state to have consented to anything. Examiners documented more than 30 separate injuries. And underneath India's fingernails, investigators recovered skin cells and blood belonging to the homeowner, clear physical evidence that she had fought desperately to survive until the very end. The jury needed only 1 hour to reach its verdict: guilty. Tenniswood was sentenced to a minimum of 30 years before he would even become eligible for release, meaning, given his age at sentencing, he will be at least 82 years old before he could ever walk free again. At the close of the proceedings, India's father addressed the court directly, describing how losing his oldest daughter had permanently reshaped their family's life. India had been born on the 24th of December, Christmas Eve. A date that had once meant nothing but celebration for their family now carries a very different weight every single year. What happened to India? Chip Chase wasn't the result of one single terrible decision. It was a chain of small, completely ordinary failures. A bail decision, a 10-pound taxi fare, a dead cell signal in a crowded building that lined up exactly wrong, at exactly the wrong moment, in front of exactly the wrong man. If this case affected you the way it affected all of us putting this episode together, make sure you're subscribed to Buried Truth Crime, because we post a brand new case every single day, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Drop a like on your way out, leave a comment with your thoughts on this one, and I'll see you in the next case.